The Coalition Academy of Applied Service had been laughing for 11 minutes, and it showed no particular sign of stopping. It was a good laugh as these things went. It rolled around the hall of instruction in layers, the way a wave folds over itself coming into a shallow bay. The Vethkani laughed low, from somewhere under the sternum, a sound like furniture being dragged. The Ulim laughed high and dry in little papery bursts, because the Ulim considered a full laugh to be a failure of composure. The Maro did not laugh at all. They made a slow grinding noise with the plates of their jaws, which meant the same thing and was somehow worse. And the Thessan, who had no dignity to protect and never had, simply shrieked and beat their long fingers against the seatbacks in front of them, until an instructor barked at them to stop. 3,100 cadets, 61 species, one holographic image rotating gently above the presentation dais, and it was the image that had started the whole thing. The image showed a ramp. That was all, a ramp. A long, dull, gray service ramp corkscrewing up through the middle of a cargo spine like a thread through a bolt. No obstacles, no fire, no swinging blades or plasma gates or predator drones, no cunning maze, no puzzle locks, just 2,140 meters of textured decking rising in a lazy helix, and at the very top a hatch. And beside the ramp, floating in the hollow at what the projector helpfully labeled actual size, was an orange box. That, said Adjunct Ovotem, in the voice of a man who has been handed a dead fish and asked to admire it, is the Terran contribution. The laughter surged again. Ovotem was Ulim, and like all Ulim he was built out of long hollow bones and skin stretched between them, so that when he raised his arms in disbelief the gliding membranes under them opened like a pair of disappointed umbrellas. He had the finest curriculum record in the Coalition. He had personally designed the Academy's celebrated Module 19, in which cadets were required to reconstruct a failed fusion regulator from memory, while their inner ear was being lied to by a vertigo field. Module 19 had a pass rate of 31%, and Ovotem was proud of every point of it. He gestured at the orange box the way one might gesture at a stain. Under the reciprocity clause, he said, each member world of the Coalition may place one Module 1 into the common curriculum of this Academy. One module by which its cadets are taught, and by which all our cadets are taught, and by which, in some small way, that world declares to the rest of us, this is what we know that you do not. He let the pause sit. Earth, he said, has given us a ramp. He did not have to work for the laugh. It came like a tide. Earth, he continued, has given us a ramp and a box and 4 hours in which to walk up one while holding the other. Somewhere in the upper tiers, a Thessan cadet fell out of his seat. The box, said Ovotem, consulting his slate with exaggerated care, as though the numbers might have changed since he last checked and become interesting, weighs 31 kilograms. 31, not 310. Not 3,000. The gravity gradient along the ramp runs from 4/10 standard at the base to 1 6/10 standard at the crest. 1 6/10 cadets, a figure which the Maro among us will recognize as roughly what they experience while lying down. There is no time trial. There is no combat element. There is no examination component. The module has precisely one objective, which I will read to you in the words of the Terran delegation, because I could not improve upon them if I tried. He held up the slate and read. Take the case to the top, open the door. The hall came apart. It went on for some time. Cadets who had spent 4 years being ground down by the Academy's celebrated cruelties, the Ulim vertigo drills, the Vethkani pressure gauntlet, the Maro endurance tanks where you learned exactly how long your species could go without complaining, found in that single sentence a release they had not known they needed. Take the case to the top. Open the door. It was so small. It was so beautifully, ludicrously small. Somebody near the front started chanting it. Others took it up. Take the case to the top. Open the door. Take the case to the top. Open the door, and the rhythm of it made it funnier. And the funnier it got, the louder it went. until Provost Ivorine Halensar rose from her chair at the side of the dais, and the chanting died the way a candle dies under a thumb. The provost was Vethkani, which meant she was 2.5 meters of silicate bone patience in a gray coat, and she had been standing quite still for the entire 11 minutes. She looked out over the hall for a while without saying anything, and 3,100 cadets discovered a sudden interest in their own hands. "You are entitled to your amusement," she said at last. Her voice did not carry so much as arrive. "It costs the Academy nothing. But you will note that the module has been certified by the Curriculum Board, that it has been surveyed by the board's own engineers, and that it is now a requirement of your graduation. All of you, every wing, every species." She let that land. "It will be attempted," she said, "and it will be passed, and we will move on to matters of consequence. Instructor Sund." And from the shadow at the back of the dais, a human woman came forward. She was old. That was the first thing everyone noticed, because the Academy did not generally keep the old where the cadets could see them. She was maybe 1.6 meters, which put the top of her head roughly at the provost's elbow, and she had a face like a piece of driftwood, grooved, weathered, sanded down by something that had taken decades. Her hair was the color of steel wool and cropped close. She wore a plain instructor's coat with the sleeves rolled to the forearm, and her forearms were extraordinary. Knotted, veined, disproportionate, the arms of somebody who had spent a lifetime holding things that did not want to be held. Her name was Margareth Sund, and the cadets, in the way of cadets everywhere, had already decided she was a joke. She walked to the front of the dais. She looked up at the tiers of them. And then she reached down beside the lectern, and she picked up the orange box, the real one, the actual object, which had been sitting there in plain sight for 11 minutes without a single cadet in the hall bothering to wonder why. And she set it on the lectern with a thump that the microphones caught and amplified into something surprisingly heavy. "This is the case," she said. Her coalition standard was accented and slow and entirely unbothered. "It weighs 31 kilos. The handle is on the side, not the top, so it hangs crooked. The handle is also too thin. You will want to change hands. You may change hands as often as you like. You may stop as often as you like. You may sit down, lie down, sing, cry, pray, or take a nap. There is no limit on rest. There is only the clock, and the clock is generous." She rested one of those extraordinary forearms on the lid. "4 rules," she said. 1. Nothing powered. No exoframes, no lifters, no field assist, no suit augmentation, no chemical, your body, the case, the ramp. 2. The case does not leave your reach. You may set it on the deck to rest, but it stays inside 1 arm's length of you, and when you go on, you lift it yourself. Nobody helps. Nothing helps. 3. You carry. You do not drag, you do not roll, you do not kick, you do not throw. The base of that case is soft composite, and it will tell us if you cheat, because it will look like it has been cheated with. 4. She lifted her hand off the lid. "At the top there is a door," she said. "It is a manual isolation hatch, of the kind fitted to every pressure spine in every station in the coalition, including this one, including the section directly above your dormitories. It is closed by a hand wheel. The wheel takes 7.5 turns. It is stiff because they are always stiff, because they sit for 40 years without being touched, and then one day somebody needs them. When you arrive at the top, you will have 10 minutes to open that hatch with your hands, not with tools, not with clever ideas, with your hands." She looked around the hall. "That is the module," she said. "Take the case to the top, open the door. Any questions?" There were, of course, questions. There were 3,000 questions, most of them not questions at all but small performances of contempt, and Sund fielded them the way a seawall fields weather. "Is the ramp trapped? No. Is there a hidden gravity spike? No. The gradient is printed on the wall every 50 meters. Check it with your own instruments. Bring instruments. Bring a survey team. The door will be held open for them. Is the case heavier than it says? No, it is 31 kilos. You may weigh it. Please weigh it. Weigh it twice. Is it a trick? That one came from high up in the Vethkani tier, in a voice like a landslide clearing its throat, and the hall turned to look, because everybody knew that voice. Keshrul Vantor was a second year, and he was, by the flat consensus of every cadet and most of the instructors, the finest physical specimen the Academy had produced in a generation. He stood 2 meters 40. His forearms had a circumference that a human thigh would have envied. He held 4 Academy records, including one, the pressure gauntlet, 41 seconds that had stood for 80 years before he broke it in his first term and then broke it again 3 weeks later, apparently out of boredom. His father was a fleet marshal. His grandmother had a moon named after her. He was not stupid, and he was not a bully, and that was precisely the problem, because it meant nobody had ever had a good reason to tell him no. Is it a trick? He said again, and he was smiling, and it was almost a friendly smile. Because if it is a trick, instructor, I would rather know now and enjoy it. And if it is not a trick, he opened his enormous hands then with the greatest respect to Earth, and to you, I do not understand what we are being taught. The hall was very quiet. Margaret Sund considered him for a while. You're being taught, she said, that everything breaks eventually. And when it breaks, the power goes and the lifters go and the clever ideas go, and then somebody has to carry the thing up the hill and turn the wheel with their hands. She shrugged. That's all, she said. That's the whole course. That's what we know that you don't. Keshrul Vantor laughed. He laughed properly with his head back, and it filled the hall, and after a moment 3,000 cadets laughed with him, because that was how it worked. Then I will take the case to the top, he said, and I will open the door and I will be back in time for the second meal. And instructor, with respect, I will do it today. The provost did not stop him. Afterwards, people would spend a great deal of time arguing about why. Some said she wanted the thing done and dusted, the human module ticked off and forgotten. Others said she wanted the Academy's best to set a mark so casual that nobody would ever think about the ramp again. And a very few, mostly instructors, mostly quiet ones, said that Ivorine Halansar had been watching Margaret's son's face during the 11 minutes of laughter, and had seen there something that made her curious. Whatever the reason, she inclined her head and said, Today, then. Cadet Vantor will attempt Module 7 at 1400. Attendance is optional. Attendance was not optional. Attendance was mandatory in every way that mattered. By 1340, the observation gallery above the base of the cargo spine was so full that cadets were sitting on the handrails, and the overflow had spread into the maintenance catwalks, and somebody had bribed a Quan technician to open a viewing port on the 3rd checkpoint that had officially been sealed since the station's construction. Which is how, at 1352, a first-year human cadet named Ren Halloran came to be standing at the very back of the gallery, on a step stool she had borrowed from a supply locker, because at 1 meter 58 she could not otherwise see over the crowd. Nobody noticed her. This was, in Ren's experience, the usual arrangement, and she had long ago stopped finding it interesting one way or another. She was 16 years old. She had brown hair that she cut herself badly, and a jaw that had been broken once when she was 11 and had healed slightly wrong, and hands that were too big for her arms, which is a thing that happens to certain people and does not stop happening. Her uniform was correct. Her boots were not. They were her own, salt-stained, older than her academy career, and she had gone through a formal appeals process to keep them. Ren Halloran came from Scary 9. You would have to look it up, and if you looked it up, you would find a cluster of wind-end tide platforms standing in the grey North Sea about 190 kilometers off the coast of Scotland, and you would find that they generated a great deal of electricity and produced almost nothing else of interest. 400 people lived there. Her mother, Ada Halloran, was a crew chief, which meant that when a nacelle bearing failed at the top of a 140-meter tower in a 30-knot wind, Ada Halloran was the person who put on a harness and went up the ladder with the tools on her back, because the lift had been decommissioned in 2081 and never replaced, because replacing it would have cost more than the people. Wren had first gone up that ladder at 9. She had gone up it carrying 4 kilos. By 12 she was carrying 11. By 14 she was carrying whatever her mother handed her, which was usually more than she wanted, and the rule on the ladder had always been the same, and her mother had said it so many times that Wren no longer heard it as words but as a kind of weather. Don't spend what you can't get back. Down on the deck, 200 meters below and 40 meters in, Keshrul Vantor stepped up to the start line. The cheer that went up shook dust out of the gallery ceiling. He played to it. Of course he did. He was 19 and magnificent, and the whole academy was screaming his name, and it would have taken a better creature than a Vethkani second year to stand still under that. He raised both arms. He turned in a slow circle. He said something to the Thessan cadets in the front row that made them fall over each other laughing. And then he bent down and picked up the orange case, and he picked it up with one hand, with 2 fingers hooked through the handle, and he held it out at arm's length, straight out level, the way you would hold up a lantern. He held it there. He held it there for a long time, grinning, while the gallery lost its mind. Up at the back on her borrowed step stool, Wren Halloran watched him hold 31 kilos out at the end of a straight arm for 11 full seconds, and she did not cheer, and she did not laugh, and something in her face went very quiet. Beside her, a Quan cadet named Nem Vosk, small, gray, perpetually anxious, and the only person at the academy who had ever asked Wren a question, and then waited for the answer, leaned in. "He's very strong," Nem said. "Yeah," said Wren. "You don't sound impressed." Wren watched Kesh set the case down, roll his shoulders, and stride toward the mouth of the ramp with the case swinging from his hand like a school bag. "He's got about 2,000 meters of ramp to go," she said, "and he just spent 11 seconds of his grip on being looked at." Nem blinked at her with all 4 eyes, one pair after the other. "Is that a lot?" he said. Wren Halloran did not answer for a moment. Down below, Keshrul Vantor passed under the arch, into the long gray throat of the spine, and the first checkpoint light blinked green above him, and 3,000 cadets roared. "It's everything," she said. The cargo spine of Meridian Station had been built 400 years before the Academy moved into it, back when the station was a freight transfer node and nothing else, and the ramp had not been built for cadets. It had been built for handcarts. That was the first thing the surveyors kept coming back to later, when they were trying to prove that the humans had rigged it. There was nothing to rig. The helix was original construction. The decking was original decking, worn shiny in the middle where 4 centuries of feet had gone up and down. The gradient plating was factory standard, calibrated 3 times a year by coalition engineers who had never heard of Earth. The humans had not built a single thing. They had walked into a section of the station that everybody had been ignoring for 160 years, looked at it and said, "Yes, that will do." They had added a start line, a finish pad, and a stencil every 50 meters telling you exactly what the gravity was. That was the entire Terran contribution to the common curriculum of the Coalition Academy of Applied Service. A start line, a finish pad, and the truth, written on the wall in numbers over and over all the way up. Keshrul Vantor covered the first 500 meters in 6 minutes and 40 seconds. He was not running. Running was permitted, but a Vethkani does not run uphill in front of an audience, because a Vethkani who is running looks like a Vethkani who is worried. He walked. He walked enormously. His stride ate the deck. The gravity at the base was 4/10 standard, which meant that 31 kilos felt like 12.5, which meant the case in his right hand felt like a coat, and he swung it as he walked, back and forth, in a great lazy arc, and every time it swung the cadets crowded into the checkpoint viewing ports whooped. At 200 meters, he switched hands without breaking stride and made it look like a dance step. At 350, he stopped, turned, and waved at checkpoint 2, where 40 Thessan cadets were hanging out of a viewport screaming his name, and the wave cost him nothing and it bought him a legend. And in the gallery 200 meters below and 400 meters back, Ren Halloran shifted her weight on her borrowed step stool and rubbed her thumb slowly across the pad of her palm. "The gradient's the whole thing," she said. She was not really talking to Nem. She was talking the way you talk when you're doing arithmetic you don't want to be doing. It's not one climb, it's 4. 4.4 to 0.6, that's the free bit. Everybody gets that free. 0.6 to 9/10, that's the bit where you find out if you've been honest. She watched the tiny distant figure swing the case. 9/10 to 1/2 is the work, and then the shelf. "What's the shelf?" "Last 400 meters, Ren said. 1.2 up to 1.6, and the ramp gets steeper, and there's a stair section." Nem Vosk did the arithmetic in his head, which the Quan are very good at, and produced a number, and did not like it. 50 kilos, he said. "At the top, the case will feel like 50 kilos. 49.6, said Ren. That's Nem stopped. He turned all 4 eyes back toward the distant, swinging, magnificent figure of Keshrul Vantor. "He can lift much more than 50 kilos. He can lift a great deal more than 50 kilos. "Sure," said Ren. "For how long?" Down in the spine, at the 600-meter stencil, at gravity 6/10 standard, Keshrul Vantor stopped swinging the case. He did not decide to. That was the thing he would remember afterwards, in the long gray weeks when he thought about very little else. He did not make a decision. His arm simply stopped swinging, the way a metronome stops, and the case came to hang plumb at his side, and he kept walking, and it was a very small thing and nobody in any viewport noticed it at all. At 800 meters, he changed hands for the 4th time. At 950, he changed hands for the 9th. At the 1,000-meter mark, which was the halfway stencil, gravity 8/10 standard, the case felt like 25 kilos and he had been carrying it for 19 minutes, and Keshrul Vantor became aware, with a kind of distant scientific interest, the way you notice whether in a country you are only visiting, that his hand hurt. Not his arm was fine. His shoulder was fine, his back was a cathedral, his legs could have gone on for a week. His hand. Specifically, the second joint of the 3rd finger of his right hand, where the too thin handle had been pressing for 19 minutes, and where the skin had gone first hot and then strangely cool. He looked at his hand. There was a red channel across the pads of it, dead straight like a seam. He flexed the fingers. They worked, of course they worked. He put the case in his left hand and kept walking, and he did not think about it again for 200 meters, which was precisely 200 meters longer than he should have waited. The gallery was still cheering. It was cheering less, though. That was the strange thing about the middle of the long carry, the thing that nobody who had not stood in the gallery could ever quite be made to understand. It was boring. It was so boring. There was a very large person walking up a very long ramp holding a box, and he had been doing it for 20 minutes, and he would be doing it for 20 minutes more, and there was nothing to look at, nothing to gasp at, no moment. The Thessan got bored first and started a card game. The Ulim got bored second and began, in their dry, papery way, to discuss the module's pedagogical failings. Half the Vethkani tier drifted off to the mess. Ren Halloran stayed on her step stool and did not move for 41 minutes. At 1,200 meters, gravity 1.0, Earth standard, the stencil said so, Earth standard, in letters half a meter high, and Keshrul Vantor walked past that stencil without so much as glancing at it. The case weighed 31 kilos, exactly what it said on the lid, for the first time in the entire climb. He was 26 minutes in. He was fine. He was also, he noticed, opening and closing his left hand every 12 or 15 steps, and had been for some time. At 1400 meters, he set the case down for the first time. The gallery saw it. The gallery came back to life like a fire finding a draft, because a rest was something, a rest was an event, and the ulim in particular sat up with a great rustle of membranes, because an ulim will always come running for the sight of somebody else's error. Kesh stood with his hands on his hips, breathing not hard. He was not breathing hard. His lungs were magnificent, and he shook out his arms, first the right, then the left in long, loose whips. He did it for about 40 seconds. Then he bent and took the handle and stood up, and the gallery cheered, and he walked on. And in the gallery, one small human girl on a step stool closed her eyes for a second, like somebody watching a driver take a corner too fast. "What?" said Nem. "What is it?" "He shook his hands out," said Ren. "Yes." "You don't shake them out. That's—" She made a small, frustrated gesture, hunting for the word in standard, giving up, using the word her mother used. "That's flushing. You flush the blood back in and it feels great, and then 30 seconds later it's worse than before because you woke it all up. On the towers you don't shake out. You just hold still and let it be quiet." "That seems very slightly insane," said Nem. "Yeah," said Ren. "It's meant to, that's why nobody does it." At 1600 meters the ramp steepened. There was no announcement, no warning, nothing but the deck tilting from a gentle 4 degrees to a very ungentle 11, and the stencil on the wall reading 1.2 standard, and ahead of him, curving up and out of sight around the spine's throat, the section the Terran documents called the shelf, and which the humans, in their own paperwork, called something less printable. 31 kilos now felt like 37. Keshrul Vantor rolled his shoulders and went at it. And here is where the last of the laughter went out of the academy, though it took a while for anyone to notice. Because he was still glorious, he was still the finest physical specimen in a generation, and he went up the shelf like a piston. He went up it the way a Vethkani goes up anything, which is to say by deciding to. His thighs, through the uniform, were doing things that made the Morrow and the viewports go silent with professional respect. He was, by any measure that the coalition had ever thought to apply to a living body, winning. He put the case down at 1750. He put it down at 1810. He put it down at 1840. And this time he sat down next to it, and the gallery, which had gone entirely quiet, watched him sit on a gray deck under a stencil reading 1.4 standard with his forearms across his knees and his hands hanging down between them like things that had been borrowed and not returned. He sat for 4 minutes. Nobody in the viewport said anything. Some of them had begun, without quite admitting it to themselves, to do arithmetic. He stood up. It took him 2 tries, and the second try was the one that worked, and there was a sound from the Vethkani tier of the gallery, a low collective intake, a sound like a room full of people all putting down their cups at once. He bent to the case. He took the handle, and the case did not come up. It came up 4 centimeters and stopped, and it hung there, and his hand simply would not close hard enough to hold on. And the case went back down onto the deck with a small flat sound that the audio pickups caught and broadcast to 3,100 cadets. And that sound was the single most important thing that had happened at the Coalition Academy of Applied Service in 80 years. He got it on the 3rd attempt. He hooked his fingers under the lip of the handle rather than around it, and he stood up with it, and he walked on. He had 290 meters to go. It took him 51 minutes. Nobody left the gallery. The cards went away. The pedagogical discussion stopped. 3,000 cadets who had come to watch a triumph found themselves instead watching something that none of them had a word for. A magnificent young man walking very slowly up a gray ramp, alone, in gravity that got heavier with every step, carrying a box that got heavier with every step, and stopping and standing and starting again and stopping. At 2,080 meters he fell. He fell forward onto his knees, and he did not let go of the case, and everybody saw that he did not let go of the case. And in the gallery something happened that nobody expected, which was that the Morrow tear began to drum. It is a thing the Morrow do. It is not applause. It is a low, slow, two-beat rhythm made with the heels of the hands against any flat surface, and it means, in the old language of the heavy worlds, we see you, keep going. The Vethkani picked it up, then the Thessan badly and then better, then everybody. Keshruel Vantor got up off his knees and walked the last 60 meters through a wall of sound. He stepped onto the finish pad at 3 hours, 4 minutes and 9 seconds, well inside the clock, and he set the orange case down on the pad with enormous care, as though it were a sleeping child, and he straightened up, and he turned to the hatch. The hatch was gray. It was set into the bulkhead at the crest of the spine, and it was perfectly ordinary, and there was a wheel on it about the size of a dinner plate, painted the flat yellow that manual isolation gear had been painted for 600 years in every shipyard in the coalition, because somebody, a long time ago, had worked out that yellow was the last color you lose in bad light. The clock on the wall started counting down from 10 minutes. Keshruel Vantor, who held 4 Academy records, whose grandmother had a moon named after her, who could hold 31 kilograms at the end of a straight arm for 11 seconds while 3,000 people screamed his name, put both hands on the wheel and pulled. The wheel did not move. He set his feet. He put his shoulders into it. He put his whole magnificent back into it, and every fiber of 2 meters and 40 centimeters of the finest bone and muscle the Vethkani had produced in 100 years, and he heaved, and his arms shook, and his hands, which had been holding a badly balanced 31-kilo case for 3 hours and 4 minutes through a gravity gradient. His hands slipped off the wheel. They just slipped off, like wet gloves. He stared at them. He tried again. He got half a turn. He roared and got another quarter. Then his right hand cramped the whole hand all at once, folding in on itself into a shape he could not undo, and he made a noise that nobody who heard it ever repeated afterwards, and he hammered his fist against the bulkhead, and he put his forehead against the cold gray metal of the door, and he stood there. The clock ran out. 3,100 cadets watched Keshruel Vantor fail to open a door. The silence in the gallery went on for a long time, long enough that people started looking around at each other, long enough that somewhere down at the front, an Ulim first year began, uncertainly, to laugh, and was silenced by about 400 glares. At the very back, on a borrowed step stool, Ren Halloran let out a long, slow breath through her nose. 7.5 turns, she said quietly. He didn't get one, said Nemvosk. He got 3/4. Ren stepped down off the stool and picked it up under one arm. That's not nothing. Nobody's going to say it's nothing. Somebody was, in fact, already saying it was nothing. Adjunct Ovotem was on his feet in the instructor's box with his membrane spread wide, and his voice carried, and what he was saying was that the course was fraudulent, that the wheel had been tampered with, that no honest hatch in the coalition required that much torque, that the humans had built a machine designed to humiliate, and that he would have the curriculum board here by morning with instruments. Provost Ivorine Halansar said nothing at all. She was watching instructor Margaret Sund, who was standing at the rail of the instructor's box with her weathered arms folded and her jaw set, looking up at the little gray figure with its forehead against the door, and there was nothing on her face that looked remotely like triumph. He'll want to try again, Sund said to nobody in particular. Tomorrow, probably. They always want to try again tomorrow. And, said the provost. And tomorrow's too soon, said Sund. His hands'll be worse tomorrow. They're always worse the second day. She rubbed her thumb over her own knuckles, absently, the way a person touches an old scar. That's the part nobody believes until it happens to them. The curriculum board came in the morning, as promised, and they came with instruments. They brought a gravimetric survey team from the Coalition Engineering Corps, 4 ULM metrologists, a moro-structural assessor with a reputation for finding fraud where fraud did not exist, and a legal adjunct whose entire function was to write down the exact moment at which the Terran delegation could be formally accused of something. They spent 11 days. They weighed the case 140 times. It weighed 31 kilograms, plus or minus 4 grams, depending on humidity. They X-rayed it, scanned it, and finally, over the loud objection of the Terran delegation, which consisted of Margareth Sund and a very bored administrator on a 2-second comms delay, they cut it open. Inside they found ballast, cast iron poured into a mold, unlovely, exactly as heavy as the documentation said. They asked why the ballast had been poured off-center. Sund said, because things are. They surveyed the ramp. 2,140 meters, original construction, tolerances within a hand's width of the 4-century-old plans. They audited the gradient plating and found it calibrated within 9/10,000ths of the Coalition standard, which was better than the plating in the Academy's own gymnasium and considerably better than the plating in the board's own transport. Then they got to the hatch, and they put a torque gauge on the wheel, and the Morrow assessor read the number off and went very quiet. 41 Newton meters to break stiction, he said, then 31 sustained, 7.5 turns. Adjunct Ovotem, who had been circling the proceedings for 11 days like a bird waiting for something to die, pounced. 41 Newton meters, no standard hatch in the Coalition. Every standard hatch in the Coalition, said the Morrow assessor. Ovotem stopped. The assessor was old and heavy even for a Morrow, and he had spent 40 years crawling through the guts of stations, and he had a particular way of speaking that made you feel he was placing each word down carefully because it was heavy, and he did not want to drop it on your foot. This is a Kessner pattern isolation hatch, he said, 600-year design. There are 11,000 of them in this station. There are 4 in this Academy's dormitory ring. There is 1. And he turned his great slabbed head toward Ovotem, 18 meters from your quarters, adjunct. Spec is 40 Newton meters. This one is at 41 because it is 400 years old and nobody has ever turned it. He handed the gauge back to his aide. The humans did not build this door, he said. They found it. That is a different crime. The board's finding, filed on the 12th day, ran to 200 pages and said in its summary paragraph that Terran Curriculum Module 7 contained no exotic technology, no undisclosed hazard, no calibration anomaly, and no material misrepresentation. That it was in all respects exactly what its documentation claimed, and that the board could identify no basis on which to strike it from the common curriculum. It also noted, in a footnote, that as of the date of filing, 406 cadets had attempted the module and 11 had passed. Nobody read the footnote. They should have read the footnote. Senate Aleriu read the finding 4 times. He read all 200 pages, including the appendices, including the plating calibration tables, which he checked by hand. Senate was ULM, and he was first in his year, and he was first in his year the way a mountain is tall, not by effort particularly, but by simply being what it was in a place where other things were not. He had never lost anything. He had also, and this was the part that nobody outside the ULM wings understood, never really tried. The ULM regard visible effort as a confession, and Senate Aleriu had gone through 4 years of the hardest institution in the Coalition without once being seen to sweat. He announced his attempt with a single line on the Academy board. An elegant problem deserves an elegant answer. Then he prepared for 9 days. He was, everyone agreed afterwards, magnificently prepared. He mapped the gradient in 50-meter blocks and computed the effective load in each. He calculated to 3 decimals the number of hand changes that minimized cumulative flexor fatigue. He worked out the optimal rest interval not by feel, but from a model of Ullm muscle chemistry that he built himself from primary literature, and which was later published and is still cited. He determined that the correct strategy was to arrive at the finish pad with a specific reserve. He even named it. He called it the door budget, and he calculated that budget at 19% of his maximum voluntary grip. It was, by any standard the coalition had, a beautiful piece of work. He walked to the start line on a sixth-day morning with 3,000 cadets watching, picked up the case, and executed his plan flawlessly for 1,960 meters. It was almost unbearable to watch. He was so precise. He rested at exactly the intervals he had computed. He changed hands on a count. He did not wave. He did not perform. He did not spend a single gram of himself on being looked at. When the gallery cheered, he ignored it so completely that the cheering embarrassed itself and stopped. At the halfway stencil, he was 11 seconds ahead of his model. At 1,600 meters, he was 30 seconds behind it and adjusted, visibly, without alarm. And at 1,960 meters on the shelf, in gravity 1.52 standard, Senate Alariu set the case down to take his 14th scheduled rest, exactly on schedule, exactly as modeled. And then he could not pick it up again. His model had been perfect. His model had also been a model of carrying. It had never once, in 9 days and 400 pages of work, considered the act of lifting 31 kilograms, 47 at that gravity, off a flat deck by a thin off-center handle, using an Ullm hand, which is a wonderful thing, long and clever and strong in tension, and which is attached to a wrist that evolved to fold a gliding membrane in a 4/10 gravity forest, and has never in 11 million years been asked to deadlift anything at all. He got it up to his knee. He got it up to his knee 11 times over the next 40 minutes, and 11 times it went back down, and the sound it made each time got a little flatter, and the gallery watched the first cadet of his year, the finest mind the Ullm had sent to the academy in living memory, kneeling on a gray deck beside an orange box with his membranes trembling, and understood, slowly, all together, the thing that the human module had been saying to them from the very first day, in words so simple that nobody had heard them. You may rest as often as you like. There is no limit on rest. When you go on, you lift it yourself. The clock ran out at 3 hours 59 and 40. Senate Alariu stood up without the case, and stood looking down at it for a while, and then he walked the last 180 meters to the finish pad with his hands empty, which was not required, and which was not permitted, and which nobody stopped him doing. He put his hands on the wheel. He turned it. 7.5 turns, easily, smoothly, in under a minute, because his hands were fresh, because he had not carried anything for the last 40 minutes, because the door had never been the hard part and it had never been the easy part either. The door was only ever the receipt. Then he walked back down the ramp, alone, in front of 3,000 people, and did not speak to anyone for 6 days. After Senate, it stopped being funny in a way that could be recovered from. The morrow went next, and the morrow were supposed to be the answer. Tovo Grelman came from a world where the standing gravity was 2.2, which meant that at the crest of the ramp, at 1.6, he was still walking uphill in a lighter room than his own bedroom. The morrow tier had been very quiet since Kesh's failure and very loud since Senate's, and when Tovo went to the line, the entire heavy worlder population of the academy came to watch, and they did not cheer, they drummed, low and slow, and the sound of it came up through the deck plates of the gallery and into people's teeth. He put the case on his shoulder. That was legal. Nobody had said you had to hold it by the handle, you had to carry it and shoulders carry. Sund watched him do it and said nothing, and something in the corner of her mouth moved. Tovo Grelman climbed 2,140 meters in 1 hour and 51 minutes without setting the case down once, and he arrived at the finished pad breathing like a bellows, and the Morotier stood up as one body, and he set the case on the pad and turned to the door and lifted his hands to the wheel, and his hands were fine. His hands were completely fine. He had carried the case on his shoulder. His hands had done nothing for 1 hour and 51 minutes. And he could not reach the wheel. He could reach it. That is not fair. He could reach it perfectly well. What he could not do was turn it, because a Moro's arms are short and immensely powerful and hang from shoulders built for pushing, and the Kessner pattern handwheel sits at chest height on a human, which is groin height on a Vethkani and forehead height on an Ulim, and on a Moro, sits at precisely the elevation where his enormous arms had almost no leverage at all, and the 600-year-old design, designed, of course, by nobody in particular, for nobody in particular, in a shipyard on a world none of them had ever seen, required a full rotation, which required a grip that could hold on through the top of the arc, and a Moro's shoulder does not go up. He got 4 turns in 9 minutes and 11 seconds. On the 5th, his hand came off the top of the wheel, and the wheel unwound, and it took back 2 turns before he caught it. The clock ran out at 5.5 turns. He was still standing there with his hands on it when the pad lights went red. The drumming in the gallery stopped so abruptly that the silence had a shape. And that, more or less, was when the Academy stopped laughing and started counting. Because the thing about Meridian Station, and about the Coalition Academy of Applied Service, and about the 61 species who sent their brightest and hardest children to it, was that they were all, in their various ways, magnificent. Every single species in that academy had come to the coalition because it had won. It had won its own world. It had beaten its own predators and its own oceans and its own ice. It had built a ship and thrown it at the sky. There was not one weak species in that building. There was not one lazy one. And in the 11 weeks that followed, they threw all of it at a ramp in a box. The Thessan came in waves, 50 at a time, sprinting, gorgeous, fastest species in the coalition over any distance you could see the end of, and they blew up, every one of them, somewhere between 1,400 and 1,800 meters, because a Thessan's entire physiology is a beautiful argument for getting somewhere quickly, and has no opinion whatsoever about what to do afterwards. The Quan tried it in relays until they read the rules properly, and then tried it alone, and their small gray bodies simply did not have the mass to fight 31 kilos in 1.5 gravities. And they knew it, and they came anyway, and 140 of them tried, and 140 of them failed, and every single one of them finished the climb. The Vethkani tried it in the hundreds, because Keshrul Vantor had failed and their honor was in it now, and they failed in the hundreds at the door, always at the door, with their great hands opening and closing on a yellow wheel like men trying to remember a word. The Ulim mostly stopped trying and wrote papers instead. By the end of the 11th week, the tally board outside the spine, a plain slate, put up by Sund on the first day, because on Scary 9 you write the numbers on the wall where everyone can see them read. Attempts, 2,847. Passes, 63. And underneath, in the second column, the one nobody had bothered to look at until the 11th week, because why would you? The passes were broken out by wing. Terran wing, 44 cadets, 41 passes. Everybody else, all 60 other species, 3,056 cadets, 2,803 attempts, 22. It was Nem Vosk who noticed. Of course it was Nem Vosk. He was Quan, and the Quan cannot look at a column of numbers without adding it up, and he had been standing in front of that board every morning for 11 weeks getting quietly more agitated. And on the morning of the 78th day he actually ran, on his short gray legs, through 3 corridors and a mess hall to find Ren Halloran. He found her in a stairwell. She was sitting on the landing between decks 9 and 10 with her boots off and her back against the wall, eating a protein bar, and beside her on the step was an orange case, and she was breathing the way people breathe about 90 seconds after they have stopped needing to breathe hard. Nem looked at the case. He looked at her. "You've done it," he said. Said Ren through the protein bar. "You've done the carry." "Yeah." "When?" Ren Halloran chewed and swallowed and looked at him with an expression of genuine, uncomplicated puzzlement, the expression of a person who has been asked when she last breathed. "Tuesdays," she said, "and Fridays. It's on the schedule, Nem. It's a class." "How many times?" "Dunno." She thought about it. She actually had to think about it, and that was the part that Nem Vosk would remember for the rest of his life, the part he would tell his own students about 40 years later on a different station in a different arm of the galaxy. She had to think about it. 19, she said. 20, I think. Some of them didn't count, my mum'd say. I put it down twice on the shelf in week 2. That's rubbish, that is. Nem Vosk stood in the stairwell and looked at a 16-year-old girl with a broken jaw that had healed wrong and hands too big for her arms, sitting next to a 31-kilogram box that she had just carried 2,140 meters up a gravity gradient for what she believed was possibly the 20th time, and who had described the 20th time as rubbish. "Ren," he said, "nobody can do this." Ren Halloran looked at him for a long moment. "Nem," she said, and she said it gently because she liked him, "everybody can do this." She pulled her boots back on. "That's the whole point," she said. "That's what the course is for. It's not asking if you're strong. It never asked that once." She stood up and took the handle and lifted the case off the step without appearing to notice that she was doing it. It's asking if you'll keep doing something boring after it stops being fun, and everybody can do that. Everybody. You just have to want it badly enough to be bored. She went down the stairs. At the bend she stopped and looked back up at him, and there was something almost apologetic in her face. "They keep trying to win it," she said. "You can't win it, you can only do it." The numbers went out on the coalition feeds on the 81st day, and by the 83rd day the academy was no longer a school. It was a wound with a name. Terran Wing, 44 cadets, 41 passes. Everybody else, 22. There is no polite way to publish a number like that, and nobody tried. It appeared on the morning digest of every fleet in the coalition, and then on the civilian feeds, and then, inevitably, on the Vethkani honor boards, where somebody had helpfully appended the names of the 411 Vethkani cadets who had failed in order in alphabetical sequence, in very small type, which took up most of a wall. 3 admirals resigned, not over the ramp, over things the ramp made it impossible to keep pretending about. A Morrow Shipwrights Guild announced an emergency review of manual isolation gear across the fleet, and discovered that on 11 of their capital ships, the emergency handwheels had been installed at heights at which no member of the crew could physically turn them, and had been signed off, and had sat there for 60 years waiting for a day that had not yet come. And on the 84th day, Adjunct Ovotem filed his motion. It ran to 400 pages, and it was, in its own poisonous way, an excellent piece of work. It did not claim the module was rigged. The board had settled that. It claimed something far more dangerous and far harder to answer, and something that a great many people in a great many wings of the Academy very badly wanted to be true. It claimed the module was biased. Not fraudulently, not deliberately. Even Ovotem was careful, in his opening paragraph, to say that he ascribed no malice to the Terran delegation, merely that Module 7 was, in its every dimension, an artifact of human anatomy, a load of 31 kilograms, roughly 40% of adult human body mass, a proportion no other member species carried habitually. A gradient of 1.6, within the tolerated range of exactly one species in the coalition, and that species had evolved at 1.0. A duration of 2 to 4 hours, a span meaningless to the Thessan, punitive to the Quan, unnatural to the Ulim, a handwheel at 110 centimeters, a handle sized for a 5-fingered grasp. The module, wrote Ovotem, does not test excellence. It tests humanity. It is a mirror, and the Terrans have hung it in our corridor and invited us to be ashamed that we are not them. He asked the curriculum board to strike it. It was, everyone agreed, going to pass. The hearing was held in the Hall of Instruction, in the same room where 3,000 cadets had laughed for 11 minutes, and the room was full again, and nobody laughed at all. Ovotem spoke for 2 hours, and he was superb. He was better than superb. He was right, in all the ways that could be checked. Every number he cited was accurate. Every anatomical objection he raised was real. When he described the Morrow shoulder and its relationship to the Kessner wheel, the Morrow tear drummed for him, softly, and he had the grace not to acknowledge it. Then Provost Ivorine Halensar called on the Terran delegation, and Margareth Sund stood up, and she said this. "He's right." The hall made a noise. "He's right about all of it," said Sund. She had not brought a slate. She had not brought notes. She stood at the rail with her weathered forearms folded and looked up at Ovotem in his box. "The case is human-sized. The wheel is at human height. The gradient tops out at 1/6 because that's what our people can do all day, and I built the course for our people first, same as every one of you built your module for yours. Module 19 is a vertigo drill. My cadets throw up in it. Should I have that struck? Course not. It's a good drill, it's just not built for us." She unfolded her arms. "So strike it," she said. "Go on, it's your academy. I'll pack it up. I'll take the case home and put it back in the shed I got it from." She let that sit for a moment. "But I want it on the record," she said, "that the door stays." Ovotem's membranes twitched. The door. "The door stays," said Sund. "Because I didn't build the door either. I found it. It's a Kessner hatch, and there's 11,000 of them in this station, and 4 in your dormitory ring, and 1 18 meters from your quarters adjunct, and I did not put a single one of them there. They were there before any of us. They'll be there after." She tapped the rail once with a blunt finger. "And when the pumps go, and the power goes, and the drones go, and the clever ideas go, and they will, sir, they always do, that's not a Terran opinion. That's just what 400 years of station does. Somebody is going to have to walk up a hot ramp with a heavy bag and turn that wheel with their hands. And it isn't going to matter one damn bit whose anatomy the hatch was designed for. The hatch doesn't care. That's what I've been trying to tell you all for 84 days. The hatch does not care." She sat down. And then Keshruel Vantor stood up. There was a sound in the hall like 3,000 people trying not to be seen turning around. He looked bad. That was the honest truth of it, and nobody had said it out loud because you did not say such things about Keshruel Vantor, but 84 days had gone somewhere and it had gone out of him. He had lost weight. He held his right hand slightly curled, the way you do when a thing has hurt for so long that you have forgotten it hurts and have simply reorganized your life around it. He had attempted the long carry 9 more times. He had failed 9 more times. He had, on the 7th attempt, made 6 turns of the wheel and been within 11 seconds of the 7th when his hand had gone, and he had sat down on the finish pad and wept where everyone could see him, and he had not tried to hide it, and something about that had changed the academy in a way that nobody could quite put into a report. "Provost," he said, "I would like to speak against the motion." Ovotem said quite gently, "Cadet, you of all people." "Yes," said Kesh, "me of all people." He turned so that he was speaking to the tiers rather than the box, which was against protocol, and nobody stopped him. "It is biased," he said. "The adjunct is correct, and I have read his filing, and it is a good filing. The wheel is at the wrong height for me. My hands are the wrong shape for that handle. The gradient is a gradient my species did not evolve in. All of this is true." He held up his curled right hand. "And on my 7th attempt," he said, "I got 6 turns, 6 and 11 seconds, with the wrong hands on the wrong wheel in the wrong gravity. 6. He let them look at it. Which means, he said, that it is not the bias that is stopping me. Nobody in the hall moved. I have thought about very little else for 84 days, said Keshrul Vantor, and I will tell you what I have found, and then I will sit down and you may strike the course if you wish. What is stopping me is that I have never in my life done a thing that did not want to be done. Everything I have ever been good at, I was good at immediately. Everything I have ever won, I won in front of people. I broke the pressure gauntlet in 41 seconds, and I have a moon in my family, and I have never once, not once, had to keep doing something after it stopped being interesting. He looked briefly at the small human woman at the rail. The Terrans did not build a course that favors humans, he said. They built a course that favors the board, and it turns out that we are all of us, every species in this room, magnificent at being watched, and none of us have any idea how to be bored. He sat down. Strike it if you like. I will keep going up it either way. There is a hatch 18 meters from the adjunct's quarters, and I intend to be able to open it. The hall was silent for 11 seconds. Then somewhere in the Morrow tier, one pair of hands began, slowly, to drum. The provost let it run for a while. Then she raised one long gray hand and it stopped. The board will vote in the morning, said Ivorine Halansar. Before it does, it will see the module performed, correctly, in full, by a cadet of the Terran wing with 2 board metrologists walking beside her on the ramp with a live gravimetric feed, with the case weighed at the pad and weighed again at the crest. She looked down at Sund. Instructor, name your cadet. And Margareth Sund did not even pause. Halloran, she said. There is a sort of silence that happens in a room when 3,000 people all simultaneously realize that they do not know who somebody is. Ren Halloran was in the back row of the 3rd tier, sitting next to a small gray Quan, wearing salt-stained boots, and she was, at that particular moment, eating a protein bar. She stopped eating it. Right, she said, to nobody in particular, and put it in her pocket for later. They gave her the pad at 11 the next morning. She came down the steps in her own boots with her hair pushed back and her hands loose at her sides, and she did not look at the gallery. And the gallery, 3,100 cadets, 61 species, the entire curriculum board in the instructor's box, 2 metrologists in board gray standing on the ramp with their instruments, looked at her the way a crowd looks at a substitution it does not believe in. She was 1 meter 58. She weighed with boots 52 kilograms. The case weighed 31. Somebody in the Thesson tier laughed once and got hit. Ren crouched and put her right hand on the handle and did not lift it. She stayed there for about 4 seconds, rocking her weight slowly onto her heels, feeling for something, and then she stood up with the case, and the case came up as though it had agreed to. She stepped over the start line at 11:02. She had gone 640 meters, at a pace so unhurried that the board metrologist walking beside her had twice asked, politely, whether she required a rest when the station shuttered. It was not a large shudder. It was the kind of thing a 400-year-old structure does, and everyone in the gallery would have written it off, except that 8 seconds afterwards every alarm panel on Meridian Station lit amber and then, one by one, in a long rolling wave that took 11 seconds to cross the hall, went red. Down at the base of the spine, the thermal manifold of the primary coolant loop, a pump assembly that had been on the deferred maintenance list for 19 years, on a station whose deferred maintenance list was 2,000 items long, because that is what stations are, let go at the flange. The loop ran up the cargo spine. It had always run up the cargo spine. That was why the spine was there. Superheated coolant went into the spine as steam, and the spine began, very quietly and very quickly, to fill. The alarms did what 600 years of coalition safety law told them to do. The thermal interlock tripped, and under Article 9 of the Common Safety Code, written after the Havarn Yard fire of the year 214, in which 400 people died because somebody took a powered lifter into an atmosphere full of atomized coolant, and it arced. Every powered system in the affected volume shut down and locked out. The gradient plating held, because the plating was passive. Everything else stopped. The bus went dead. The maintenance drones dropped where they stood. No exoframe, no lifter, no field assist, no powered anything could enter that spine, and no override existed, because the override had been deliberately designed not to exist. And at the crest of the spine, at the top of a 2,140-meter ramp, in 1.6 standard gravity, in rising heat, the primary isolation valve of the coolant loop sat behind a gray bulkhead with a flat yellow handwheel on it, and its remote actuator, 400 years old, item 1106 on the deferred list, did not answer. Chief Engineer Rasa Voltem got to the base of the spine in 9 minutes, and did the arithmetic in front of the provost, and her voice was very steady in the way that voices get. 4 hours, she said, maybe 4.5. Then the loop empties, and when the loop empties we lose the reclamation stack, and when we lose the stack we lose the agricultural ring, the soil, provost, 40 years of soil, the seed vault, everything that makes this station a place people can live instead of a place people are stationed. Nobody is in the spine. Nobody is in the spine except, the engineer stopped. Everybody turned. 640 meters up the ramp, at gravity 0.62 standard, in a rising white haze, a 16-year-old girl in salt-stained boots was standing very still with an orange case in her right hand, looking up the helix into the throat of the thing, and listening. "The kit," said Rasa Voltem. "The manual valve key, the packing gland set, the wrench. It is 32 kilograms and it must go up that ramp on somebody's back. And there is nothing else. Nothing, Provost. There is no other way, we have no other way, and whoever takes it has to still be able to turn 41 Newton meters when they get there, 7.5 times. Provost Ivorine Halensar stood at the base of the ramp of the long carry, in the Coalition Academy of Applied Service, with 3,100 cadets behind her, and looked up into the steam. "Instructor Sund," she said, "how long does your cadet take?" Sund did not consult anything. 2 hours and 51 minutes, she said. Cold, in heat, with 32 on her back instead of 31 in her hand, call it 3.5. That is very close to 4. "Yes," said Sund. "Can she do it?" And Margaret Sund, 61 years old, of Scary 9, who had spent 40 years going up ladders in the dark, because the lift had been decommissioned in 2081, looked up the ramp at Ada Halloran's daughter. "Provost," she said, "I've never met anybody who can. I've only ever met people who did." The comm crackled. The girl's voice came down the spine, flat and unhurried and slightly muffled, the voice of someone who has already put the protein bar back in her pocket for later. "Someone want to bring me the bag," said Ren Halloran, "or am I coming down for it?" Keshrul Vantor brought her the bag. Nobody assigned him. He was simply not there, and then he was on the ramp, going up through the 6 gravity at a dead run, with a 32-kilogram engineer's kit over one shoulder and a coil of packing rope over the other, and he covered 640 meters in 4 minutes and 11 seconds, which was, and remains, the fastest anyone has ever gone up any part of that ramp. He arrived beside her out of the haze, like something falling out of a cloud. Ren Halloran looked up at 2 meters 40 of Vethkani, breathing like a furnace, holding the entire weight of the station's next 40 years on one shoulder, and she said, "Put it down." He put it down. "Now stand still," she said, "and stop breathing like that." He tried, it took him some time. She waited patiently in the rising steam, while the finest physical specimen the Academy had produced in a generation got his lungs back under his own authority, and then she crouched by the kit and started going through it. Key, spanner set, packing rings, she counted them. Out loud twice, a follower wrench, a light, 2 liters of water, and a roll of gray tape that she looked at for a moment and then put in her pocket. "They're straps," she said. "What?" "The kit's got straps." She held one up. It was a plain webbing harness of the kind that engineering kits have had straps of for 600 years, and she looked at it with something that was almost affection. "Shoulder straps. It's a rucksack, Kesh." "It's not a case." "Is that good?" "It's the best thing that's happened all day," said Wren Halloran, and she meant it. She shrugged the kit onto her back and cinched the straps down, and the weight went where weight is supposed to go, which is onto the hips, onto the frame, onto the skeleton, which is a structure that will hold a load all day for free and ask nothing back. And her hands came off it entirely, and she flexed them once, twice, and let them hang, and they were fresh, and they were going to stay fresh. And that was the whole plan, and there was not one other thing in it. "I'm coming with you," said Kesh. "Yeah," said Wren, "I know." They went up. It is a strange thing to be famous for, but the ascent of Wren Halloran on the 85th day is one of the most watched pieces of recording in the coalition, and there is almost nothing in it. That is what people say afterwards when they have watched it and are trying to explain what they watched. There's nothing in it. She walked. She walked at a pace that the 2 board metrologists, following behind with their instruments, described in their filed report as materially slower than the subject's demonstrated capacity, which was the closest a board metrologist had ever come in writing to saying that a person was walking annoyingly slowly. She stopped every 4 minutes. Not when she was tired, she was not tired. Every 4 minutes on account, whether she wanted to or not, and she stood with her hands hanging and her eyes closed for exactly 40 seconds and then went on. The metrologists timed it. It never varied by more than 3 seconds for 3.5 hours, and it did not vary when the heat came up, and it did not vary when the steam thickened, and it did not vary at 1900 meters when everything hurt. She did not shake her hands out, not once. At 1100 meters, the heat crossed the board's limit, and the metrologists were ordered back down the ramp. And one of them, an Ulim, young, who had spent the previous 80 days helping write the 400-page motion to strike the module, stopped at the turn and looked back up at the small figure disappearing into the white, and then took off his board badge and left it on the deck. And that recording is also very widely watched. At 1200 meters, Keshrul Vantor said, "Give me the kit." "No. I am 4 times your strength." "Yep," said Wren Halloran. "It is 32 kilograms and there are 900 meters left and the gravity is about 2. Kesh, she stopped walking. She turned around. Steam was rolling off the deck between them and her face was scarlet and streaming and completely calm. "You can carry it. I know you can carry it. You'll carry it faster than me and you'll carry it further than me and you'll get it to 1800 meters. Easy, and then your hands will be gone, same as they went at 1800 every single time, and I'll take it off you and I'll go on. That's fine. That's a good use of you, that is. But then I'll have carried it for the last 340 meters at 1.6 with nothing in the tank, and my hands will be shaking. And when I get to the gland nuts, I'll cross-thread one, and then we lose the ring." She turned around and started walking again. "Or," she said, "you can walk beside me and count my rests." Behind her in the steam, Keshrul Vantor stood still for 4 seconds. Then he came after her, and he did not ask again. And for the next 900 meters, in a rising white heat that would have been dangerous for a human alone, he walked beside a 16-year-old girl and counted to 240 out loud, over and over, in a low grinding voice like furniture being dragged, so that she would not have to spend any part of herself on keeping the count. That in the end is what he is remembered for, not the pressure gauntlet, not the moon. At 1600 meters they hit the shelf, and the deck went from 4 degrees to 11, and the stencil said 1.2 standard, and 32 kilograms became 38, and Ren Halloran did not change her pace by a single step. At 1800 she went down. Not dramatically. She simply put a boot wrong on a wet plate and her knee folded, and she went down on all fours with 38 kilos on her back, and the kit drove her flat, and she lay on the hot deck for a second and a half with her cheek against it. Kesh reached for her. "Don't," she said, into the deck. He stopped. "If you pick me up," she said, "I'll have learned that I get picked up." And she got her hands under her and she pushed, and she got a knee up and then a boot, and then she stood all the way up with 38 kilograms on her back in 1¼ gravities in her own time, and she stood there swaying for a moment and then said, quite conversationally, "Right, where were we?" 211, said Keshrul Vantor, and his voice cracked in the middle of it, and neither of them ever mentioned that. They came onto the finish pad at 3 hours and 19 minutes. The steam at the crest was a solid white wall, and the heat was ferocious, and the coolant loop was screaming somewhere behind the bulkhead like a kettle the size of a house. The gravity was 1.6. Ren Halloran weighed 83 kilograms and the kit weighed 51, and she had 1 hour and 11 minutes before the reclamation stack went, and she was, according to the medical telemetry that the Academy would pore over for the next decade, in almost perfect condition. Her heart rate was 141. Her core temperature was up 1.9 degrees. Her grip strength, measured 20 minutes later, was at 94% of her morning baseline. 94%. She had walked 2,140 meters up a gravity gradient in a steam bath, carrying a third of her body weight, and she had arrived with her hands almost entirely unspent, because she had spent 3½ hours refusing, over and over, in 100 small, dull, unglamorous decisions that nobody watching had even noticed, to spend them. Don't spend what you can't get back. She got the kit off, she crouched at the hatch. And then she found out that the wheel would not turn at all. Not stiff, not 41 Newton meters. Seized, the stem swollen in its packing gland with 400 years of neglect and 3 hours of superheated steam, and she put the valve key on it and leaned and the key bent, and she took it off and looked at it and set it aside without a word. The gland then. There are 4 nuts on the packing gland of a Kessner pattern isolation valve. They are 11 millimeters. They hold down a follower ring, and under the follower ring are 5 rings of graphite packing, and when the packing carbonizes it grips the stem like a fist, and there is exactly one way to fix that, and it is the way it has been fixed for 600 years. You back off the 4 nuts, you lift the follower, you pick the old packing out with a hook, ring by ring, and you thread in new packing, ring by ring, and you snug the follower back down in a cross pattern evenly by feel, because if you over-tighten it you seize the stem worse than before, and there is no gauge for it and there never has been, and the only instrument that has ever worked is a pair of hands that know what snug feels like. Ren Halloran knelt on a hot deck in 1.6 gravity, with steam scalding the back of her neck, and did fine motor work for 31 minutes. The recording is not dramatic. That is the thing people always say. She kneels. She holds the light in her teeth because Kesh, whose hands had gone at 1,500 meters and had not come back, could not hold it steady enough. She backs off 4 nuts. She drops one and it rolls, and she says a word that the Academy's transcription software rendered as unclear, and she goes and gets it. At minute 19, she cross-threads the 3rd nut going back on. She feels it, you can see the exact instant on the recording, a small stillness, and she stops, and she backs it all the way off, all the way every thread, which costs her 90 seconds she does not have, and she blows the burr out of it and starts again square. She is 16 years old, and there is 1 hour and 1 minute left on the loop, and she takes 90 seconds to do it right. At minute 31, she snugged the last nut and sat back on her heels and said, "Okay." Then she stood up and put both hands on the flat yellow wheel. And it moved. It moved about a centimeter, and then it stopped, and she pulled again and it went another centimeter, and the whole hatch groaned, and somewhere behind it 400 years of stiction let go of a stem, and the wheel turned. The first turn took her 90 seconds. The second took 40. The third and fourth and fifth went in a little over 2 minutes together, and she was making a noise now, a low, flat, continuous sound with no shape to it, and the heat had taken the skin off 2 of her knuckles, and she was not aware of it and would not be for some hours. On the 6th turn her hands slipped off. They just slipped off, like wet gloves. Exactly the way they had slipped off for Keshruel Vantor, exactly the way they had slipped off for 411 Vethkani, and 140 Quan and 900 Thesson. And she stood there with her arms hanging and looked at the wheel with an expression of mild professional irritation. And she said, "Yeah, all right." And then she did the thing they teach you on the towers. She hooked her right elbow through the spoke of the wheel, up to the joint, so that the load was on bone and not on skin, and she hung. 52 kilograms in 1.6 gravity is 83 kilograms of girl hanging off a wheel spoke. The wheel came round. She reset, she hooked in again. She hung again and walked her boots down the bulkhead, and it came round again, and the sound coming out of the valve stem changed pitch, and Keshruel Vantor, who could bench press a shuttle strut and who could not have turned that wheel to save his own life, stood in the steam with his ruined hands at his sides, and watched a 16-year-old human girl use her entire body as a counterweight, over and over, because she had run out of grip and had not run out of mass. The 7th turn seated at 3 hours 54. The half turn, the last half turn, the one that drives the seat home, the one where the torque goes up and not down, the one that everybody forgets about, took her 4 minutes and 11 seconds. And then the screaming behind the bulkhead stopped. It did not stop dramatically either. It ran down, the way a kettle runs down, and the steam thinned, and somewhere far below at the base of the spine, a pressure gauge that 400 people were staring at stopped falling and hung there and then, very slowly, began to climb. The loop held. The reclamation stack held. 40 years of soil stayed in the agricultural ring, and the seed vault stayed cold, and Meridian Station remained, for the foreseeable future, a place where people could live rather than a place where people were stationed. Ren Halloran sat down on the finish pad with her back against the hatch she had just closed, and she took the protein bar out of her pocket, and she found that she could not open the wrapper. She looked at it for a while. Then she held it out without a word to the Vethkani sitting beside her, who could not open it either. They sat there together, 2 people with 11 working fingers between them, and after a moment Keshruel Vantor began to laugh, a real laugh, from under the sternum like furniture being dragged, and it went on for quite a long time, and Ren Halloran started laughing too, and that is the recording that plays in the Academy's entrance hall to this day, and there is no sound on it, because somebody decided there didn't need to be. The curriculum board voted the next morning. Adjunct Ovotem withdrew his motion before the vote was called. He did it briefly and without ceremony, and he did not make a speech about it, and afterwards he went down to the base of the spine and stood in front of the slate board for a long time, and then he went back to his quarters, and 18 meters from his door he stopped, and looked at a gray hatch with a flat yellow wheel on it that he had walked past 4,000 times. He put his hands on it. He could not move it. He was 54 years old and first in his generation, and he had designed Module 19, and he stood in an empty corridor and could not move a wheel that any child from Scary 9 could have moved, and nobody ever knew what he thought about that, because he never told anybody. What he did do, and this is a matter of record, was file a request the following week for permission to attempt Module 7. He failed 11 times. On the 12th he passed. It took him 1 year and 4 months, and he was the second non-human ever to do it, And when he came off the pad he was crying so hard he could not speak, and the first thing he did when he could speak was ask who had gone first. Because someone had by then. Keshrul Vantor passed Terran Curriculum Module 7 on the 209th day, on his 31st attempt, at 3 hours 26 minutes, and he did it by walking so slowly that the gallery got bored and went to lunch, and he did it by stopping every 4 minutes on account, whether he wanted to or not, and he did it by refusing 100 small, dull, unglamorous times to shake his hands out. He arrived at the door with 61% of his grip. 7.5 turns, 2 minutes 9 seconds. He stood on the finish pad afterwards with his hands on his knees, and when they asked him, the feeds, the fleets, his father, the entire watching coalition, how a Vethkani had finally cracked the human course, he gave the answer that is now carved over the arch at the base of the spine, in 61 languages, in letters half a meter high. "A human girl taught me how to be bored," he said. "It is the hardest thing my people have ever learned." They never renamed the module. Sund wouldn't let them. It is still Terran Curriculum Module 7, Low Discipline, and it is still a ramp and a box and a door, and the pass rate across the coalition, 4 decades on, has climbed to a little under 30%, which the curriculum board considers a triumph and which Margaret Sund, until the day she retired, considered mildly embarrassing. They wanted to give Ren Halloran a medal, several medals, a Vethkani honor name, a Morrow drum right, a moon if she wanted one. The coalition is generous when it has been frightened. She took none of it, and she went back to class the following Tuesday, and on Friday she did the long carry again, because it was on the schedule, because it was a class, and the gallery was packed to the rafters with 3,000 cadets who had come to watch her, and she went up in 2 hours and 49 minutes and did not look at any of them once. Afterwards, a first-year Thessan caught her at the bottom of the ramp, hopping with nerves, and asked her the question that everyone had been asking for 85 days and that nobody had thought to ask her. How did she know she could do it? Ren Halloran set the orange case down on the deck, in reach, the way you do. She wiped her palms on her trousers. She looked at the ramp for a moment, all 2,140 gray meters of it, corkscrewing up into the dark where the door was. "I didn't," she said. "Nobody knows that. You just pick the thing up and you go slow and you don't spend what you can't get back and you keep going after it stops being interesting." She picked the case up again, because it was hers to put away, and nobody was going to do it for her, and she headed for the storeroom. "That's all it is," said Ren Halloran over her shoulder. "That's the whole trick. It's not that we're strong, it's that we're still going.